Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Lens with your hosts, Jake and Scott. In this week's episode, we head to Main Street, Louisville, Kentucky, to Angel's Envy and sit down with Owen Martin. So sit back and buckle in to the latest episode of the Bourbon Lens. Owen, it's great to be downtown Louisville on a crisp December morning with you. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I was going to say thanks for having me, but I guess you're at the distillery, so I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, exactly. You're happy to have a job, right?
Yes, every day.
Man, it's a busy time of the year. Have you recovered from all the Thanksgiving food and started to think about, what the holidays have entailed for you?
Man, I mean, it's an interesting position to be in because I feel like I'm always half thinking like a year, 5 years out, and then also I'm trying to live like week to week.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. Maybe somewhere in there. Yeah. This is gonna be about as quiet as it is for the next month or so, and then we'll be kicking right back into it.
Yeah. I mean, as a dad like us, you get it. Now you got to think about holiday gifts, and you got to think about going places for the families. And Scott was in Cincinnati recently with Thanksgiving.
Freezing my butt off.
Yeah, you went to a football game, idiot. I turned down the UK U of L game because it's cold and Kentucky's probably going to lose. So
you were right about that. They did.
They did lose. But after 5 years of beatdowns, you got to let the little brother win every once in a while.
Yeah. Keep it interesting.
Keep it interesting. Yeah, you got to get the Louisville fans excited about losing next year on their home field. But anywho, that's neither here nor there. Do you travel any? Because you're originally from Kansas City. You going to go anywhere for the holidays?
Yeah, we spent Thanksgiving in St. Louis because it was kind of a halfway point back to Kansas City from here. So I have some family there, and then we actually met some family halfway.
Nice.
But we'll go back to KC for Christmas.
Bringing bottles of Angel's Envy along for gifts?
Always. Yeah, I have to. If I show up empty-handed, I'm booed out of the room. So yeah.
Who's this guy?
Yeah.
Well, the good thing about being in the whiskey industry, you always do have a gift that you can bring, right? Whether it's Angel's Envy now or previously Stranahan's or from the Scotch world. I'm sure you've never shown up to a holiday empty-handed.
No, my wife's a great baker, so she always comes to parties with cheesecake and that sort of thing, and I'm more the lazy one who just scours my office for whatever's at hand and brings that.
What a man! Yeah. That's so me. I feel that. I feel that so hardcore. But excited to talk Angel's Envy. It's been a while since we've been here. We interviewed Wes, episode 56 or something like that.
It was
Early
a long
days.
time ago.
Yeah, a while ago. And excited because you've taken over. It's been a fast 2 years, I feel like.
Very fast, yes.
So, for people who don't know you, can you talk a little bit real quick about your upbringing in the world of whiskey?
Sure. Yeah, well, as mentioned, originally from Kansas City, I got into the beer industry, I guess, unofficially early. So that was my summer job during high school, was kind of working on a beer bottling line. And that was my first exposure to the fact that people could make a living off beverage alcohol. Granted, I couldn't legally drink at that point. Anyway, that was sort of like stored in the back of my head as I went off, did engineering school, thought I was going to maybe go, I guess a more traditional route at that point. But towards the end of my time at KU, Jayhawk,
Okay.
I think Louisville, I'm safe, birds to birds, but I wouldn't wear my Jayhawk gear outside of the city too much. But anyway, knew by that point I was going to finish the engineering degree, but having done a couple internships, didn't want to go the traditional desk jockey job. And so beer kind of re-entered my mind and, wanted to really just take the homebrewing I had been doing and formalize that into a potential career. So started bothering local breweries. Boulevard Brewing was the main one that gave me an internship, and then started applying for brewing schools. So this was, whiskey hadn't even factored into my mind at that point. It was something I was drinking at dive bars, but not something I was sipping or savoring or, the current place I find myself.
For sure.
This was sort of where craft beer had peaked in retrospect. So, I was riding that wave along with a lot of other people, and all the schools I was looking at were waitlisted, were very expensive, and I, wasn't actually that patient. So through looking around online, I'd found a program in Scotland that was a master's degree in both brewing and distilling. And you had to have a technical undergraduate to apply. So it felt like I was still kind of carrying on the trajectory without completely wasting my last 4 years of undergraduate. And packed up and moved to Scotland. So through living there for a couple years and then starting to learn more about making whiskey, albeit in a single malt sense, and then drinking quite a lot of single malt. And I sort of took a second pivot from beer into whiskey over my time there.
Yeah.
So I did my master's thesis with a Low Lens Distillery, briefly looked at sticking around there, but for a few reasons, it was time to head back home. And so pretty much packed up and moved straight to Arkansas from Edinburgh. And
Culture shock there?
a little bit of reverse culture shock, I would say. But really, the 2 years I spent there, I kind of viewed as the second half of my degree or my learning, right? So it was taking everything I'd learned in a classroom setting and then formalizing that in a very much craft, all hands on deck, wear every hat type way. And as we were talking before off camera, I guess you'd say, we were filling about 10 barrels a week.
Yeah.
So I would spend all day mashing, overseeing fermentation and distilling all at once. And then we would have people in and run volunteer bottlings in the evening. So it was like 10, 12-hour days, again, in a very much craft setting. But I think it was a great way to really get a wider view than I would have if I jumped right into a big place.
Yeah.
And then a friend I had made in Scotland, who's briefly, he was in the year before I was, had vouched for me for the job at Stranahan's. And so I moved there in 2016. I was there a little shy of 7 years and went all the way from night distiller as I started to then running fermentation, overseeing R&D. And then by the end of my time was the head distiller and production manager there. And a lot of what I was doing day to day was just blending, right?
Yeah.
And blending special releases, blending different finishes with the Snowflake release. And so that was kind of the parallel track back over to Angel's Envy, not in terms of base whiskey, right? But in terms of looking at finishes, how you finish, how many times you fill a barrel, how you might pair finishes together, and creating new products with all that in mind.
Yeah. Well, you go from like one of the forefathers of American single malt to one of the forefathers of finishing whiskey, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of parallels in those two organizations.
Absolutely. And I mean, so because of what I'd inherited there, right, and the shoulders I was standing on, so to speak, Rob Dietrich, I got a crash course in finishing, and Stranahan's had been finishing for quite a while, albeit hadn't made the whole brand presence on that like Angel's Envy did, and really pioneered that in the bourbon space. But there was quite a few years of learnings there that I was able to kind of glean and help out with, and then sort of shape my own processes and production techniques so that by the time I got here, I was kind of hitting the ground running.
So that's a really good thing. Like you talked about standing on someone's shoulders. Like what's it like following, Rob Dietrich, the Hendersons? Like, that's a big thing. Like I didn't even think about that, to be honest.
Yeah, no sweat. No.
I got this.
I think when I've talked to other people in my role, I think when you really, get beneath the surface, you're not talking about whiskey, you're just talking about their personal lives, whatever else. Everyone who I feel a kinship with has had those moments of imposter syndrome, myself certainly. And I don't want to say it's a fake it till you make it, but you just have to kind of trust your instincts, right? And let the whiskey, I always want to say I want to let the whiskey do the talking. And, I would say the first year here was pretty nerve wracking, right? Because that was putting down a lot of the projects that have come out since then, or more so this year. But like until you really start getting that feedback from, local writers, local podcasters, national press, like you can think you're on a pretty good track, or sometimes you stress that you're not. But once you start getting that feedback, and I think we've had a really good run of releases this year, I think that's really affirmed that I do belong in doing what I'm doing. But I think, in more of a, I guess, culture sense, you'd say, I always, both at Stranahan's and here, want to behave in a way that's like respectful for those that came before me. Like I wasn't the founder of either of those companies, right? Which is great. The best way I've heard it described is that you're kind of like a steward of the brand you're working for. And I always try to keep that in mind. Like I'll have plenty of runway to make all the releases I want to and all the nerdy special releases. But like certainly when we're talking about products that predated me in Colorado and predated me here, like it's behaving with respect to those. And I always try to like think about where Lincoln's head might be at with what a product I'm making. And if it feels like a natural and authentic thing to be doing for the company. And if it's not authentic to Angel's Envy, then I don't necessarily really want to pursue that.
For sure. And another thing you said off camera is like, you've had conversations with Wes, like, and like, having that bridge there, I think is really good. Like no one's on no hard terms. It's just like, you're carrying forward.
And for Rob or for Wes or for Kyle, like I know that they're just a phone call or text away. And I feel like I've had a pretty good relationship with all those folks. I probably don't talk to them as much as I should, but certainly when it's, I mean, hey, everybody's busy.
Yeah, for
but
sure.
like we were talking about out with the bottle and bond before we started recording, that was when I felt very specifically I wanted to get Wes's blessing on because it was an idea of Lincoln's and of them. And, I always try to be very transparent of not taking credit for things that are not mine, but being able to execute that and being able to execute projects that were ideated by our founders is a pretty cool thing in itself.
Yeah, no, definitely agree. And I know we're going to get, for everyone listening, we're about to get nerdy here because
it's only one way, man.
True. This is the way. You have a unique experience. You talked about it in your kind of your intro there around working in Scotch and then working in craft distillation and then moving into American single malt and now bourbon. Like there's a lot of differences in that, right? Like no distillation is the same. Even column stills, no two column stills are the same. They all act and behave differently.
Sure.
So for you, you're getting your point. We talked a little bit about this off camera. Is you're getting to stretch fermentations and things like that. Like what similarities have you seen across those different stops, and what are the main differences that you've kind of seen across those different stops?
Oh boy, yeah, let's dive into it. Yeah, so I mean, with respect to what I was doing in Colorado, even though it was single malt and I guess Scottish style in that sense, we were still using all new cooperage, and so that's I guess the most close parallel between the last two stops for me is that knowing how new cooperage behaves and then I guess keeping that in mind with how we behave with finishing casks. So a good example of that, we released a very limited run of sherry single barrels this year when we did Oloroso. We finished that for about a year and a half. I've used PX before. So in the sherry scale, right, Oloroso's drier, nuttier. PX is about the sweetest end of the spectrum you can. I love using PX for like used cooperage stuff, specifically malt. But when we're talking about new cooperage stuff, whether it's malt, rye, or bourbon, I find that PX almost fights that new cooperage, right? Because you have inherently a sweeter new barrel, right? You get the caramels, you get the vanillas, as opposed to one that you've used over and over again. And so you want to keep that in mind with not, I guess, layering sweet on sweet on sweet to the point where it like fights itself.
Yeah.
So there are definitely parallels, but and I would say in terms of the base spirit, even though what I was doing in Colorado was off grain and more of the Scottish style, small grain wise, right? That malt probably is more similar to the rye that I'm doing here, or the rye whiskeys I'm working with here. And so I've found that some of the stuff that worked well with malt, I'm more inclined to use with rye here. I like using, I guess second fill wine barrels. So we'll use first fill for like our single barrels, but a lot of the projects I've been working on in the background, I've been reusing those barrels a second time. And those ones I usually gear towards bourbon.
Yeah.
Whereas rye, I think I can do more with some spirits and other things of that nature.
No, I think, and that goes back to what happens in Scotland, right? Like everything is first, second, third fill barrels.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. And you mentioned Compass Box kind of like as a joke, like I wish you could just call myself a whiskey maker. I think that's the thing that I found interesting about their blending and everything is they use a lot of second, third fill casks in their blends as they make up their whiskeys.
Well, and I think from a purely nuts and bolts financial standpoint, right? Like I'll always talk about flavor, but like for the triple oak that we've been working on, we're buying French oak barrels that are damn near $800 a pop, right? How much a waste of money would it be to use that for 3 months, which is what we did for the first run, and then just punt it, right? So from a financial standpoint, it makes sense to try to get as much money's worth as we can, but also from a flavor standpoint, the analogies I like to use when I'm kind of doing public tastings are, I guess if I'm talking to British people, I use the analogy, like think about a barrel like a bag of tea, right? British people, like they just get that. So it's like each time you steep it, that bag of tea, you're getting less color or less flavor out of it. Easier analogy there even is just like a wet sponge. Like each time you're squeezing it, less color, less flavor. So by law, American whiskeys, bourbon and rye, we use that virgin barrel. We're getting the maximum amount of color, maximum amount of flavor out of it. That's great. And then Scotland will reuse that multiple times because legally they can and we can't. But because we're a finishing whiskey brand, we actually have the leeway to sort of now still view whiskey from that lens, but in the finishing cask sense, right? By law, we're still only using the virgin barrel to mature the whiskey. But then when we start talking about finishing barrels, I'm going to use those French oak barrels multiple times. I'm going to use these port barrels multiple times sometimes across one product or sometimes across multiple projects.
Maybe I'll get the terminology wrong, but like STR barrels, like shave, toast, recharred. Is that anywhere in the spectrum here?
Man, you're reading my mind, man. So we're actually talking to a local cooperage who's just got a custom toasting setup going in the last few weeks. And it's something I would like to look at. I don't think we'd ever really do it in a huge sense.
Yeah.
But there are a couple Scotch brands that I'm fans of that have used that. And I think it might be a way for us to get like one more usage out of a port barrel that we're pretty much at the end of its life.
Yeah.
So maybe that was revealing too much, but probably too early to be said. We're just going to run a few trials with them first.
Yeah.
But if those trials go well, it's something I definitely have on my mind as something to explore.
Well, in terms of like sustainability and things like
absolutely.
that, it's like you're not wasting.
Right. Well, in the same way we talk about using a barrel as many times as possible from a financial standpoint or a sustainability standpoint or a flavor standpoint, like might as well have them. If we have them on hand, why not experiment with it?
Yeah.
The last thing I want to do is send a barrel out the door that I could have done something else with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's one of the big things, right? Is like when you are a finishing house, right? Like with that being the backbone of what you do, you're trying to get as much life out of that barrel as humanly possible.
Absolutely.
Because it paid, it paid its life, for to be that barrel.
Yeah.
That would.
Yeah, we did a fun one this past year that I think will also set the standard for some of the projects I'm working on in the next few years, where we sent when we dumped the rye barrels, we sent those to Puerto Rico. They filled those with 8-year-old rum, right? Because they were doing a rye cast version of their 8-year-old. And so basically they seasoned those rye barrels for 6 months with 8-year-old rum. And, instead of just having them sit there, I was like, hey, I'm giving you these. I want those back.
Come on.
And so we actually got those back and started using those as finishing casts. So again, from a sustainability standpoint, not only were we kind of closing the loop on the barrel, but they were getting rye barrel character out of it, and they were getting rum barrel character out of that same cask. So I think, we'll see what sort of projects those result in or products those result in, but I'd like to try the same thing with Irish whiskey, try the same thing with Scottish whiskey. Anyone who's going to be potentially using our barrels for a product, I at least want to have the conversation of what getting those back looks like.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and interesting enough you said that. There's a rum out of Bermuda that they do a rye finished rum, and it is or a rum finished in rye barrels, and it's phenomenal. And so I think that would be really cool because your rye whiskey is already super molassesy anyway.
Yeah.
So to get a seasoned version of that back, I'm sure it would be even more molassesy.
Yeah, and I think obviously we're owned by Bacardi, so there's a lot of Bacardi distilleries there. We got Dewar's as the blending house, but Aberfeldy, Craig Ellicky are under that. Teeling in Ireland, Bacardi itself in Puerto Rico, and so I think there's also value there to me being, we talk about people being a phone call away. The head blenders or head distillers of those distilleries are a message away. And so even when I'm looking at like what a specialty project looks like a cellar collection, that sort of thing, if I can work in-house from a financial perspective, like, I'm paying shipping cost on really high-end barrels sometimes. It's like something that would be $500, $600, $700 if I bought it through a broker. A lot of times can be $20, $30 if I'm just working with somebody in my portfolio.
Yeah.
So again, from a financial perspective, makes sense. But also like if I'm just like, hey, what specialty projects are you doing next year? Like, great. If I want to get some of your normal barrels, great. But like, I want to get your highest end barrels. What do those look like? Mm-hmm. And really they can then tell me why they did something, what flavors they're expecting from that product. And we can almost shape a project together. And I think that's a really cool way to do it.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a cool thing is like the interoperability.
Shit. That's a big word.
Yeah. But like working within the organization, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't realize Bacardi had their tentacles that far into whiskey
Scotch,
overall.
yeah.
So that was really interesting to me to pick that up.
Yeah, and I mean, even from a blending side, it's been really valuable to me to be able to interact with the Irish whiskey makers and the Scotch whiskey makers because I found that there's actually a lot of parallels that we're all doing from a blending side, and we can get into that in a little bit, but like specifically like the marrying of whiskeys, right? And for me, it's like taking different finishes, pairing them and marrying those together. In terms of what we did with cask strength the last couple of years, we married those for months before we ever even bottled it, and I'm finding that both Teeling and Dewar's do a very similar thing for their high-end products. So really cool to see what just sort of organically is popping up across the whiskey space globally.
Yeah.
And where they're finding successes or struggles and maybe how I can learn from that as well.
No, I think that's really interesting. So let's talk about blending because one of the things you mentioned to us as we kind of walked around and saw the expanded, beautiful space here at Angel's Envy. If you've not been downtown, book a tour. Now till Christmas, is a good time to come, or good luck. You know, it's the easiest
Book online, right?
Yeah, book online.
Yeah, I was, I probably should have expected when you go to the big leagues, you're in the big leagues, but I didn't really expect how far ahead people have to book their tours.
Oh, yeah.
And I hear about it all the time. So, please book ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one piece of advice for the Bourbon Trail, period.
Yes.
Just plan.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, visit Fraser's Museum, get your passport as you stop in for the first time and you're sad because you didn't get to go anywhere. And then you plan your tour out from there, expanding all the time. But talking about blending, because that's what you said you've done mostly, and you all have put out a variety of new products, whether it started with re-releasing the Cellar Collection earlier this year, the Bottled and Bond, which was the straight bourbon. You did the Triple Oak, I'm sure, and now the Cask Strength just came out. What's it like to be able to, take your mind off of the fermentation and the distillation process and working? Your mind's probably never off of it.
I don't know that happens, but
be able to put that blending hat on and then borrow from that resources.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good question. I've addressed it with other folks in that really 2 years in the company, every barrel I'm working with predates me, right? So kind of like the way I ended at Stranahan's, I just picked up here as a blender. When we talk about fermentation or different grains or different types of whiskey, that's all happening in the background, but it's like two parallel tracks where, from a blending standpoint, I can take whiskey that predates me by a long shot, like 10-year-old whiskey, pair it with a finishing cask I like to use and have a new product out in a year, right? That's almost like the fast track. And then the slower one is taking stuff that's going to be off the still that has to start maturing from day one and then shaping that as we go along. So that's all the stuff that's going to come down the line.
Yeah.
But this year, so often I get my blinders on. I'm working on a project, and I move into the next project, work on that. But we were able to take a step back after Cask launched a few weeks ago. And really, I hadn't really thought about it in this sense until I was talking to my marketing team, but I was looking at all the releases from this year, and there's definitely this sort of common through thread about blending, right? So as you mentioned, we did a re-release, we call it a tri-pack of the first 3 Cellar collections that Angel's Envy had launched. But a lot of times, those base whiskey barrels didn't exist from that time period. And so that was honestly, it was one of the hardest projects I've ever worked on because I was trying to recreate prior releases. And, as a blender, as a whiskey maker, I'm always trying to make the best whiskey I can all the time. Best whiskey's always going in the bottle, but that had the secondary objective of being as close to the prior release as possible. So hugely time consuming project. I think we did pretty well on it, but it was a very interesting way to crack into the year. Then we followed that up with our Bottled and Bond release, our first ever unfinished release in June. And that was a blending project in itself as well because we were blending low proof and high proof barrels to hit exactly 100 proof, right? So another thing that had this sort of side stipulation in addition to making the best whiskey we could. And then we moved into Triple Oak, right? And so that was the first addition to our signature series in over 10 years. We launched with the port finished bourbon, followed up with the rum finished rye not long after that, but really hadn't had anything that was a day in, day out release in quite a while. And so playing in the oak realm with that and layering those different oak varieties on top of each other from a blending perspective and seeing how they complemented or contrasted each other. And then that, really went straight from that into Cask Strength, which for the first time this year, we put Tawny Port finish in as well. And so it's playing Ruby Port and Tawny Port together. And so really, like I said, if you look at it from the whole year, there is sort of this story that gets told from a very much a intense blending to create the best release, but all these other, I think great examples of, as a whiskey maker, as a blender, the things that are going on in the background of your head that really the public doesn't necessarily see.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think next year we'll be busy again, and every year we'll be busy, but
busier than this
specifically this year was us really, the rubber was hitting the road and we were jumping off.
Yeah. Well, I think that's also really interesting because we have this debate with many people in the marketplace, but he just said this, a secondary oak finished barrel, and people call it double oaked. They just triple oaked it. That is a finished bourbon.
Oh, the eternal argument.
The eternal argument.
Is double oak.
It's been funny to talk to bourbon nerds and have them argue that that's not finishing. And I'm like, well, it says finished on it says Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey finished in a second oak barrel or whatever. I'm not talking about our product, other people's products.
Yeah.
So it's not finished, but the word finished is right there. okay, we split hairs, whatever. Like, I'm not going to have this argument.
That's what everybody does.
But I mean, that is a good lead into how we developed that product, though, because to me, into that exact same argument, like Angels Envy had only ever really played in what I would describe as the European finishing run. Mm-hmm. And by that, I mean wine and spirits, things that are commonplace in Scotch whiskey for decades and decades. And, up until recently, I think the American conception of finishing is you mature in a new oak barrel, you finish in a new oak barrel. And so I don't disagree that those are sort of two different schools of thought.
Yeah.
And it was one that I was like, okay, what's the white space for Angel's Envy? And we had never played in the double oaking, the second oak barrel, toasted or otherwise. And so I was like, this seems like the opportunity. And also, if we're going to have a wine finished bourbon that everybody knows us for, then if we're going to have another day in, day out bourbon, it has to be distinctly different. And so, that we iterated that quite a bit till we got to the final product. But yeah, I think you touch on how that jumped off as a product and really the initial sessions that we spent talking through what we wanted to do there.
Well, I think it's an interesting thing using chinkapin and Hungarian and French gives you a lot of flavors and a lot of just different things that pull out of that barrel.
Yeah. And again, as an unabashed person who comes from the Scotch industry, like I find a lot of bourbons to be over oaked after the initial maturation. And so that was sort of the hurdle I'd set for myself was I want to play in the secondary oak space, but do it in a way that is not over oaking it. And so as we said earlier off camera, like the way we did that is by refilling those barrels multiple times, right? Which is the same way we treat our port barrels. For our single barrel and for our cask strength, we are almost always using first fill port, right? Because if we're going to do higher proof stuff, older bourbons that are more oak forward, then you want to scale your finishing cask character up to balance that. Mm-hmm. But then when we talk about like our core product, our flagship, it's all the way down to 86.6 proof. So we actually use a lot of second fill, third fill port barrels as a way to sort of, keep that port character in check and just a nice kiss, a nice hint of it. Yeah. And so that same sort of ideas and those same usages of finishing barrels were definitely applied to triple oak. So the very first batch we used second fill Hungarian, we used first fill French, first fill Chinkapin. The second batch that's being bottled as we speak uses those same French oak barrels a second time, but those matured over the summer.
Yeah.
So it was kind of cool actually, and this one surprised me. Roughly the same finishing time in the exact same French oak barrels, but when you look at the seasonality of it, they ended up heavier, more oak, more color on the second fill of those same barrels, which was kind of crazy. Like I was expecting summer would do something to it. I just didn't know it was going to come back even over the top.
Yeah.
And so it's a good example of how I think we're going to treat that product going forward is, I could talk about exact percentages, exact finishing times, all that good stuff. But like the goal there is that I'm going to pull those up and down as I need to create the same profile.
Yeah.
So
starts and ends with the barrel.
Yep, exactly. Well, yes, exactly. Starts and ends with a barrel. And I think the best way I've heard it described is like product over process even. So it's like, I want what's in the bottle to taste the same a year from now or 5 years from now. And whatever, things I need to tweak to get to there, I will.
Yeah.
The one thing I wanted to hit on, and we briefly mentioned it about the bottled and bond. Mm-hmm. It's a cask strength bottled and bond.
Yes.
How did we arrive at that?
Yes.
Versus just proofing to 100 proof?
Right. So it was a long process. I'll start out by saying that as much as I would love to claim it as an idea of my own, as it was relayed to me, this was an idea of Lincoln's himself. And there was, I spent probably the first 3 months here just reviewing all the stuff that was down, both in terms of finishing cask and base whiskeys. And so, kind of came upon those barrels, saw that we were doing low entry proof, was, trying to figure out what was going on there. And then it sort of got the background on what the idea was. And so those were, I guess, the backbone of that whole project was 103 proof. 103 entry proof rather than 124.7, which is what we do day in, day out. And then gaming the maturation environment, right? So everybody knows about angel share. Hotter environment, you lose more out of the barrel. Cooler environment, you lose less. But this was gaming more of the humidity part of it, right? Mm-hmm. So like Colorado, where I made whiskey before, or even the top floors of our rick house are drier and hotter. And so you actually wick more water out of the barrel and subsequently your proof goes up. You're losing both water and alcohol. You just lose water slightly faster. Mm-hmm. So we did the opposite, or they did the opposite with these barrels and did 103 entry proof, but then put them in palletized warehouses in basically the bottom set. And so the most humid, the coolest environment, and game that to where they would start dropping in proof, right? So here's where I don't know exactly what the intention was. I don't know if Lincoln's idea was that they pulled it out the minute it hit 100. I'm not saying that was his idea, but I don't love that idea anyway, because that's not a flavor driven idea, right? That's letting the proof dictate the product and not the maturity of what's in the bottle. But ultimately it didn't really matter, because by the time I'd even got around to tasting them and getting an eye on them, they'd already dropped down to about 98, 99 proof. So couldn't have been done anyway. But as you guys know, Bottle and Bond is one distillery, one distilling season. And so that was kind of the fun part. And where blending then came into effect is that we had normal higher entry proof barrels from that season, and then just started playing with it.
Yeah.
And in that way, we were able to let it mature. And actually, we've done a second batch of it that's even a few months older. We'll probably do some other batches that are going to keep creeping up in age, and I like that. All the batches so far have been right around 6 years old, and I thought that was a great place where it had reached a mature profile.
Yeah.
And then we were able to just blend with a little bit more oak forward, a little bit higher proof bourbon to then bump that back up to 100.
Scott, it's right in your wheelhouse, man.
Yeah. Well, it's something that most people probably overlook whenever it came out. It was like, it's a cast strength. 100 proof.
We've definitely had some people double take at it. And I think, obviously it is a product that is made for the whiskey nerd, which is cool. And I think it has all these different cool usages, and some of which I didn't even see until we started getting it in front of people. But one, I'm always thinking about, what bottles am I bringing home for Christmas, right? And my parents, God bless them, they love wine. They want to say they like bourbon. Do they really like bourbon? I don't know. But to deliver a cast strength experience, right? That super coating, rounded mouthfeel, no water added, and to do it at 100 proof at a more approachable one, not just for my parents, but just for anybody, is really cool. I think, as we've started to integrate that into some tastings here, the goal with any whiskey we make is that I should say none of those nerdy details. And I should be able to just pour that whiskey in front of somebody. Again, maybe not even say that it's bonded, right? And they take a sip of it and they're like, that's delicious. And they want another sip or they want another pour. And if that's the box one to check. If I haven't checked that box, all the nerdy stuff is for nothing.
For sure.
Right? So the whiskey has to stand on its own, and then I can come back in the background with all the nerdy details and hit it for the whiskey nerd that I think would really, dig that.
Yeah. Well, I think that goes to there's a lot of scotch that comes out at cast strength at 99, 100, 103. So I think, again, it all kind of feels like it's work that you may have started when you were in Scotland that's kind of coming full force here at Angel's Envy.
Absolutely. And I think in terms of another hint, right? Like if you guys have tried the casting Bond, that low entry proof and that cool maturation environment, it has very little oak to it, which again, maybe speaks to my Scottish background. It's all super soft, super rounded, right? And actually blending in the high proof was a way to add a little bit more oak back into it, as well as the proof adjustment. But when we think about what a 10-year-old release looks like from us down the line, or a 15-year-old or whatever, that's where my mind's going to, because again, from a over oaking standpoint, people potentially just putting an age statement on there to do it, and it doesn't really taste that good. I'm like, well, this stuff I'm pretty confident can go the distance, and I'm not losing 8-10% a year. So again, from a functionality standpoint, by the time I dump that at 10 or 15 years, I'm confident there's still a decent amount left in it that's worth doing a run of. So that's kind of where my mind goes when we're talking about longer term projects with, you're always trying to look at ways of spinning and keeping your products new and unique, right? So our single barrel program being port finished, our cast strength being port finished, that's all sort of haloing back to the normal release. But I'm like, now that we have the bonded out, or now that we have the triple oak out, how do I start riffing on these down the line?
For sure.
So fun things to come.
And you did the cast strength rye was one of the things you did in year one. So, you've riffed on a lot of the traditional practices and products, which I think is cool because it keeps a brand new and fresh, right? And I think that's what, the next generation of whiskey drinkers that maybe are not enthusiasts, but love the casual whiskey, out at a bar, they want to be like, oh, this is the new thing that we have. And you can try that and experience that with a flight or whatever. And so I think that's what's exciting. It's what's drawn me back to Angel's Envy.
Yeah. No, sure. I think it goes back to what we were saying a few minutes ago of trying to innovate in ways that feel authentic, right? And that's always something that's on my mind. Shit, man, you go back, like I said, I was a night distiller not too many years ago. I wasn't talking to anybody, let alone getting on podcasts with folks. So I come from more of a pure production background, but the further I've kind of moved into the roles I find myself now, it's very much the story I'm telling around the whiskey and the why. And I like that, right? Because that allows me to flex that creativity in a different way. But I'm kind of at the point, I think the industry's at the point where it's not enough to just make a delicious whiskey anymore. You have to have a reason. You have to have a story around why you're doing it. And not just a story that you made up, like it's my grandpa's recipe or whatever, like a story of like, this is what it means to me and this is what it means to the brand and this is why we're extending it in that direction. And I think, like you said, for a bulk of consumers, maybe they don't need to know every single detail, but if you're telling it with passion about why you made it and why it means something to you, I think that's what resonates with people. Yeah. And the whiskey has to taste good. Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it starts and ends with taste, right? Like, you know, if you smell it and you're like, ugh. It's like when someone pours you Malort, you're like, no, thank you.
Oh, God.
See, I like, maybe not in a whiskey sense, but I like grapefruit and I even kind of like pith. So I'm a big hot sauce guy and, you know, big whiskey guy, obviously. So maybe my taste buds are just kind of beat up.
I think you might be the only person on earth that says that they like Malort.
Oh, man. Yeah. Hey, I'm easy, man. I like Malort and I like peated whiskeys unabashedly, like I said. So like, I'm not saying those will necessarily work their way into an Angel's Envy sense, but for my own home bar, these are things that exist there.
Well, I mean, you know, you talked about distillation, like a hint of peated malt or something, right, could give a smoky back end that you're looking for. When you talk about maybe changing grain or pitching different types of yeast and stuff that we talked about off camera, like why not have just a small percentage of peated malt, like a 1% or 2%? It's not going to
I think that goes, I guess that's kind of thinking in a blending mindset, but with a distillation one, right? Of like creating something with balance, even from your base product. And I like that because, I mean, 2 years into my time in Kentucky, there's definitely like an anti-peat sentiment I've picked up on, which is fine, right? Like people like what they like. I'm not going to, you know, point fingers at anybody, but the cool thing about being at the scale we are and being essentially a global brand now is like I can make something that potentially has like some degree of peat to it. And even if I know it's not going to be a hit in the distillery, I still want to launch it because I feel strongly that if we're going to make something, even if it's only in like airport travel retail or only in, you know, European countries, it should still have availability here so that a super fan can get it.
Yep.
Even if I know it's maybe not the target audience. And then, you know, speaking of target audience, like if I want to do something that's a different flavor profile that has some smokiness to it that maybe isn't going to resonate in Kentucky, well, I'll put it in the airport and see what people think about it there. Or it's just a cool way that if I'm trying to win over like a Scotch drinker, like I can bring them into the fold via that.
Yeah.
And I think that goes back to Angel's Envy as a whole, where it's like when I'm talking to an American consumer, somebody with a baseline understanding of it, I'm talking about finishing as like the differentiating factor there, right? Like, yeah, you may like this bourbon or that bourbon, and those are great for this reason, but then this is what makes us a little bit different. If I'm talking to like a European consumer, oftentimes I'm using finishing as the parallel, right?
Yeah.
If there's somebody who is immersed in Scotch, finishing is just kind of like something they're used to. And so then I'm using that as a parallel to come back around and talk about the differences of American whiskey.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like a very basic, broader view of how I speak about Angel's Envy, depending on the audience I'm talking to. But then we can get even more nerdy with that and like, okay, peat, or okay, maybe it's a wine barrel that's only available in Australia or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, I think Teeling in our portfolio does a really good job of that, of playing a local angle and doing a special release around that. And that's something I'm very much looking forward to getting into in the next probably like 5 years or so.
Oh, cool. No, I think it's exciting. I think it's an exciting time for Angel's Envy. And if you get a chance and you're in Louisville, this is a must stop, I believe. The gift shop is beautiful. There's a lot of stuff to buy. And, you know, right now, Cask Strength is sitting on the shelf. Probably won't last long.
Both the bonded and the yearly one. Yeah,
it's all out. So I would say check out Angel's Envy, and we're excited, Owen, for what you all are going to be able to unfold over the next several years, and excited for the continued push. Really appreciate you joining us today. We hope everyone has a great holiday season, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Cheers.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bourbon Lens. Make sure you're connected with Scott and I via social media on Instagram, X, and Facebook. We'd love to connect. And if you're more the professional type, follow us over on LinkedIn. If you want to know more about Bourbon Lens, make sure you're subscribed to our weekly newsletter, The Weekly Pour. For exclusive content and more, check out Patreon. Follow us there at Bourbon Lens. And last but not least, on your favorite podcast listening app, make sure you're subscribed, because every Monday, Scott and I release a podcast, and we would love to have you here listening to the newest features and the newest whiskey news. And until next time, cheers.